Welcome to the Happily Family Conference. We are your hosts. I'm Cecilia
And
Hilkey,
I'm Jason Hilkey.
and we are delighted today to have Dr. Joseph Lee with us. Joseph is a psychiatrist with a practice in Southern California. Early in his practice, he saw that his patients were clearly getting better, but didn't seem to be quite well. His search to help people truly thrive led him to a truth-based perspective that he's been applying personally and professionally, built around developing self-worth, meaningful relationships, and lifelong optimal healthiness. Becoming a parent made him more intentional about every aspect of his own life, trying to figure out the best way to raise his kids while maintaining his own health and well-being. Welcome, Joey. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for coming back, Joey.
Good to be here, always. Thank you.
Great. So I'm just going to get it out of the way. We're calling you Joey. And we're trying to figure out, but we talk to you often, and I just think I'd be weird to call you something else. So
Dr. Lee.
We always try, and it lasts about like 14 seconds.
Yes.
Okay. So here's what I want to talk to you about. Because a lot of times when we talk to parents and teachers, some of them have a little bit of hesitation when we say, yeah, just make agreements with kids. You don't need to have rules. You don't need to do timeouts or punishments or rewards or threats or bribes. And they're like, what?
Like it feels good to them, but they are concerned.
Like scary. It feels a little scary.
Is this really going to work? Is this going to mess up my child permanently?
Yeah. How is my kid going to turn out? So I wanted to talk to you about what we know looking at the research, how kids turn out, and why there is some really nice evidence for justifying a more compassionate approach to parenting and a compassionate approach to education. So first, let's start out with punishments and timeouts and like behaviorism.
All right, so we're just going to ease into the easy topics. Okay.
Yes.
So I think to maybe frame our larger conversation, when we talk about like how kids turn out, what we're saying is how do we want our kids to be when they are adults, right? That's kind of what we're saying. When they are self-sufficient, mature adults on their own in the world, how are they going to be? Like, and so when I've done my personal sort of talks to groups on parenting, and I know different sort of perspectives on like social emotional parenting, they kind of do this very similar exercise too, which is you ask the audience basically this question, which is, who do you want your kids to be when they're adults? And people usually will universally describe the same types of characteristics. I want my kids to be happy. I want them to be well-rounded. I want them to be good people. I want them to be kind. I want them to be successful. And so people kind of describe very universally similar characteristics. And what they're ultimately describing is a healthy human being, a well-rounded, healthy human being. And then you can also do a follow-up question and say, well, if that's the kind of person you want your kid to turn out to be when they're an adult, the follow-up question is, describe to me the type of person you do not want your kid to be when they're an adult. And then people will describe things, well, I don't want them to be selfish. I don't want them to be cruel. I don't want them to be lazy. I don't want them to, be dependent on other people. I want them to be well-liked, and so it's like, so you're also then in many ways, by answering that question, you're describing maybe a universally unhealthy person. So that's kind of the frame, right? And then we can then go backwards and say, okay, then how does our impact as the adults in the lives of children either lead them towards that place where they are exactly the characteristics that we want them to be, healthy human being, and how do we avoid sort of guiding them or compelling them or influencing them, or in other ways neglecting them in such a way that they end up being the type of people we don't want them to be. All right, so that's kind of maybe the larger frame, and then that's how I think we can make sense of why, for example, behaviorism is not the best strategy, and why maybe social emotional learning is much better if we're really trying to get to that place. So we'll start with behaviorism. So behaviorism, what that is basically it's this area of psychology that was mostly sort of founded and developed in the mid part of the 1900s by B.F. Skinner and a lot of his colleagues. The history of psychology at the time, sort of modern psychology, was built at first around Sigmund Freud, who came up with psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis, and because Freud was a physician, a couple of influences there, really did focus on like what was wrong with people, like in a medical model. And the other thing about psychoanalysis as the foundation of sort of modern psychology was that it wasn't particularly scientific in the same way that a lot of other scientific disciplines were scientific, which would be, you know, observation, experimentation, hypothesis, research. Whereas psychoanalysis, in terms of how you learned it, was really kind of like this old school master apprentice kind of style. You had an analyst, you became analyzed, then you became an analyst, then you analyzed other people, and it was kind of like this. So it wasn't particularly scientific, and then people branched off and came up with their own theories, and they practiced it and became their own gurus. Okay, so that's a history. So B.F. Skinner comes along at a certain time where there was sort of a basic understanding that, you know, what had become the predominant perspective on psychology, on human psychology, was not particularly scientific, and it was really preoccupied with negativity, the negative characteristics of human behavior. So B.F. Skinner comes in and he does a bunch of experiments with animals, mostly mice, pigeons, dogs. And he was able to demonstrate that the scientist, the experimenter, can do a lot of different things to get that mouse to do this or to not do that. And he was able to repeat the results over and over again. And so it was sort of like, look, you can control the behavior of these animals and these mice by doing certain things. And this is where we get a lot of this language: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, a lot of things that we're maybe familiar with now. And then so based on like this very broad base of knowledge about animal behavior, people, including Skinner himself, started saying things like, and therefore, in humans. And then they kind of made this leap. And the thing is, if you're comparing it to psychoanalysis, you know, behaviorism was like so scientific, at least in appearance. And then it really started making psychoanalysis seem like woo-woo, you know, where it talked about like things that happen in your childhood might affect the way you, like, that just sounded so unscientific compared to like these crystal clear sort of studies where you can repeat over and over again. And then people could like not only do them with, you know, read about it in books, they can start doing things with their dogs at home and then with their really young children. And then people are like, look, the experiments I'm conducting in my own home, you know, with my own children, are demonstrating the scientific validity of behaviorism. And then again, so this therefore towards human beings became like the norm. And as a result of that, it kind of justified things like the kind of parenting strategies that said, no, you should, you know, teach your kids in this way. And I think in indirect and subtle ways, that has continued to impact a lot of systems, including parenting, including education, including government, including our legal system, where people of power or influence kind of use these kinds of strategies to control, manipulate, or persuade the people that they have power over or leadership over. And so, you know, typically, so authoritarianism as a leadership style is very much tied to, and in some ways justified by behaviorism. Okay, so
and Joey, can I jump in and say, was this specific to the United States? Is this worldwide? Was this European at the time? Where was this happening?
I think kind of probably anywhere that's still maybe in the Western world where, you know, the influence of this kind of like scientific discovery, you know, would have influence. And so I think for the most part, we're still probably talking about the Western world. But, you know, I think at the same time, I think, you know, if we're talking about from maybe a sociological perspective, if we're talking about when this has all happened and when, and even in the sense that there's still some influence of this now. I do think that living in a more global society, look, this has trickled out for sure. And the other thing is authoritarianism as a leadership style has like existed like in the history of modern man, right? Always. So behaviorism is just like the pseudoscientific stamp of approval upon a certain leadership style to kind of justify like, no. Not only can we prove that this is scientific, you know, the science says you ought to do it. Is sort of like how it works. The main challenge though is that behaviorism falls apart based on this simple idea. The simple idea is that human beings are not animals. And we come into the world with underdeveloped brains, and human beings relative to other mammals come into the world with very underdeveloped brains. But at some point, our brains become so sophisticated that there's nothing like it, you know, in any other animal on the face of the planet eventually. But in the beginning, we're really, really immature. So we actually have, you know, the parts of our brain that do respond to like behaviorism coming out as being somewhat more mature, whereas our sort of, let's say our prefrontal cortex, the place that eventually, as it develops, becomes the part of our brain that gives us our very sophisticated, high-end, sort of nuanced, but very human characteristics. That's what's maturing through our childhood into our adolescence, into our adulthood. So what you kind of do see, though, is, yes, earlier on in life, when our brain is still developing, those parts of our brain, the limbic system that responds to fear, or maybe our pleasure circuits that respond to rewards, you know, those come out relatively intact, you know, developmentally. But again, it's the rest of our brain that we really sort of know makes us human. And so that's ultimately why behaviorism breaks down and is not a good philosophy for all these systems that we're talking about, because indirectly, whether the main intention is this or not, it is in some ways kind of dehumanizing. And as a result of that, you know, if we can kind of like then broadly make the connection, then we would say that if we really want our kids to grow up to become adults that are fully mature, optimal human beings, then we can't have strategies built around behaviorism. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I like how you've broken that down into an understanding of why it works, especially when we're young, and why it doesn't work, and why we wouldn't want to be using it as our more mature brain begins to develop, and the history of it.
We wouldn't even want to, I would argue that we wouldn't even want to be using it when you're dealing with a less mature brain.
Right. And I think one way to think about this is, you know, at worst, strategies that are heavily built around behaviorism, punishments and rewards, create a stagnation in development, because you're really sort of spending all this time reinforcing behaviors and things learned in sort of the limbic system, the sort of the anxious, fearful part of the brain, or the reward system. And at worst, you know, the investment of all that time and energy into those strategies means that you're kind of maybe digging a hole that eventually you're going to have to climb out of, you know, and that kid will have to like climb out of that hole themselves. Or maybe later on in life, you know, parents will ultimately figure out that these sort of behavioral strategies that they've been applying, or teachers will find that the sort of the sticker charts and things like that they're using to try to get kids to do the work is ultimately fading away and it's not working. Like, that's a hole everyone will have to dig themselves out of, you know, to find alternative ways to motivate. And at the end of the day, what you ultimately drift towards is patterns of things that are more socially, emotionally oriented, like intrinsic motivation, emotionally motivated, you know, motivated towards things like self-competency. So you got to dig yourself out of that hole. And oh, go ahead.
Can I talk about that hole a little bit? Because okay. I think what you're talking about with the issue is that behaviorism works, like punishments and rewards work, but they don't work for the reasons that we want them to work.
Work for the long term.
And
Yeah.
we know that with behaviorism, with punishments or rewards, that in order for them to continue to work, the reward needs to get bigger and better. The
Right.
reward won't work, or the punishment won't work as soon as we're out of the room and not there kind of reinforcing things.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of parents and kids get into a trap with, okay, when my toddler, wanted to do something bad and I just like distracted them with a cookie, gave them a cookie for behaving well, then that cookie has to become like something really much bigger and better. And ultimately I'm looking at like losing my influence. Would you agree?
Yeah, I
That.
think that that's definitely the inevitable path I think you will find yourself in. And this has to do with how those kind of parts of the brain do work. You know, for punishments or threats of punishments to continue to work, you actually have to activate fear. So the kid actually has to feel afraid. On the reward side, which is a different circuit, the reward actually has to excite them enough that they're willing then to do the thing that you just asked them to do. So they still depend on emotions, right, for these kids to experience. But then you kind of see the vulnerability there, right? Then if a kid is no longer afraid or activated by the previous sort of punishment or threat of punishment, and that's been your tract, then you actually have to escalate the punishment, right? And if we're really sort of talking about what are we trying to accomplish on that side of the equation, we're specifically trying to say we're trying to make our children afraid. Like that's specifically the goal we're trying to get to. And then on the other side, the reward side, it's normal in reward circuits to have less pleasure as you continue to repeat the exact same experience. So in a very simple way, for like outside of the scope of what we're talking about, like if you go to your a new restaurant and it was the most amazing experience you've ever had, the second time, the very next time you go to that restaurant, and you're excited to go back, it is probably still going to be very enjoyable, but it's not going to be as enjoyable as the first time. And if you go a third time and then a fourth time, relatively quickly, if you keep going to the same restaurant, order the exact same food, even though the first time was maybe the best meal of your life, it's pretty normal for you to kind of diminish in your ability to enjoy that. So that's a pretty normal process called like habituation intolerance would sort of be the normal process, or the words that we use to describe what happens in those reward circuits. So same thing on that side of the equation. If you're a parent or an educator who's using these kinds of systems, you actually have to always be prepared to come up with more, right? To excite and entice. And then one of the systems, and one of the ways I try to persuade both parents and educators to really consider, why these strategies are ultimately not worthwhile, in addition to what we've said, is, these systems actually require a lot of effort and resources on the part of the parent or the educator to expend, right? You have to come up with ideas that always need revision over time to keep doing this. And you have to expend energy in order to implement these sort of strategies over and over again. And so it's also a process indirectly as to why ultimately I don't think it's good, not just for like the kids and the students, but it's also not good for the parents or the educators, because it's ultimately an exhausting process, because it's always requiring the expenditure of effort and energy on the part of the person in authority as well. So because again, these systems never are sustainable. They require more input all the time.
And I wanted to just make sure I understood when you say we're digging ourselves into a hole with that. Yeah. What I take that to mean is that besides having to escalate, whether it's the punishment or the reward, we're also creating these neurological connections that say this is the way things work. And it's very easy to be greasing those skids as they're growing up with that behavioral style of of interaction and motivation.
Right.
And so the digging yourself out of the hole analogy is the purpose, or the process of breaking apart those connections and those very familiar ways of behaving or motivating, and recreating new, or trying to create stronger neurological connections that are intrinsic motivation. Is that a fair assessment of what you mean by digging yourself into the hole and trying to get out?
Yeah, right. And I think that's exactly what I mean. Because ultimately, those are not healthy pathways, and ultimately they're not sustainable pathways. So you're inevitably going to come to a place where everyone's just going to agree this is no longer working. And at that moment, it's not as if you get to start from a blank slate. Even when you have that insight, your insight tells you not only do we have to find a new way, we have to undo all the sort of the investment of learning regarding seeing the world in this way. So it's costly in that sense, and that's the whole I'm talking about. And also what's, and this ties to the other side. So that's sort of at worst. But let's say even if the experience of behavioral strategies is implemented, and it doesn't feel or seem that costly, it's still not time invested in maturity. Hmm. So another way to kind of understand why ultimately time spent in behaviorism is not just the potential like harm, right? The whole analogy that we're talking about. Another way that it's not useful or good is that whatever time and energy you're investing in the context of behavioral strategies is not time that's spent developing those more sophisticated areas of the brain that ultimately, like we say, contribute to that picture of our mature, healthy adults.
That makes sense. Yeah, I get that. And as adults working with kids, whether it's as a parent or a teacher or anything else, one of the things we're motivated to do is to be teaching our kids skills, or working with them to have them grow and support them in a way that they're building skills that are going to last them for the long term. So why spend the time? Why invest that time and energy into something that's not going to last them and benefit them for the long term? That's a fantastic argument for why not to do it. I could go on, but
and I also want to say too, for anyone listening, that it's never too late to change how we've been relating to kids, whether we're a teacher or a parent. It's never too late for kids, even adults, to get more neural connections. We know that emotions and experiences shape the brain, and that continues throughout our entire life. So we don't need to go kind of crazy and beat ourselves up when, oh my gosh, I yelled at my kid, or oh my gosh, I gave them a timeout, or oh, I slipped back into these old ways. We all do that. Jason and I do stuff that we regret and we goof up a lot of the time, but it's about continuing to reflect and come back. So I just want to lay that foundation as we're moving forward, and talking more about what can we do and what sorts of things do we want to provide for our children. But before we go into completely what can we do, let's talk about some of the myths. There's a myth out there that, oh, well, I just give my kid lots of praise and positive reinforcement and cheer them on. And why is that another myth?
It's at the core, it's totally true, and I think this is why it rings true. It's totally true that being positive towards your kids is far superior than being negative, abusive, or harmful, right? And I think sort of the history of sort of like the be positive parenting style, which has been pervasive for a while here, was, I think, a very appropriate sort of attempt to respond to the idea that says, maybe corporal punishment and these kinds of strategies in parenting, or even actually we know that, even in a lot of states that you can still do corporal punishment. At least it's still legal in certain states to do it even in the classroom, right? So this is a part of our history. But at some point, people are like, okay, maybe that's like a bad idea. And it is a bad idea, to like punish kids, so that they learn. And I think the response to that is, okay, so let's not do that, right? So let's only be positive. Let's just, every time they're positive, we reward them. And that's how we're going to like help them, learn and grow. We'll just focus on the positives. The problem with that is that's still behaviorism, right? So it's two sides of the same coin, but that's still the same coin. And all those previous problems that we talked about in terms of not developing those higher order areas of the brain, still reinforcing the more primitive parts of the brain, the reward circuits, the overall sort of expenditure of energy and cost from parents and educators of having to keep those systems in place with the rewards. I think it's the more positive side of behaviorism, but ultimately it's still behaviorism.
Yeah.
So the same arguments we're making as to why behaviorism broadly isn't ultimately a good strategy to really help people learn and mature. That includes both, yes, punishments, no good, but that also includes a system that's predominantly built on rewards and praise and making kids feel good live in the moment, activating their reward circuits of the brain is also not good, even though it feels good.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes sense from what we've talked about. And also that some of the concerns I've heard from employers are now that we have these kids coming out of college, going into the workplace, and the employers are faced with this new conundrum of needing to provide bigger and better rewards, very much what we're talking about. But now this is in the workplace, and they're needing to, I hate generalizing to millennials, but that's kind of what's been happening is we're saying that a lot of millennials are struggling with feeling some level of satisfaction in their work that isn't directly tied to having an award or some kind of acknowledgement for the work that they're doing. Is that an example of what's happening kind of as a byproduct of the Be Positive parenting movement?
Absolutely. I think that is very much connected, right? Because I think if we're talking about people who are currently in their 20s, they are the sort of kids that are now, that we're saying have now become adults. And so what are we seeing? And so, a lot of what you're seeing is that people are in their 20s entering the workforce. And maybe for the first time in their life, they're not being sort of recognized or rewarded for achievements like good grades or being the best, because the needs of the present and future workplace are more things like competency, accomplishment, getting your work done, being autonomous, not having to have a boss sort of give you a daily agenda as to like, here's what you should be doing for the next 8 hours. And, and at the end of the day, checking with your boss and boss saying, good job, like that's not how the real world works. But you can actually see how like maybe right before that, that's still how a lot of people in educational systems and then parenting have experienced the world. So it's kind of a very sort of abrupt change. And what you kind of see in a very nuanced way, right, is in these characteristics that, yes, again, not all millennials, but a lot of sort of characteristics that people typically attribute to what we're recognizing generationally is, the perfectionism, the sort of need for recognition, sort of expecting that, that they should be given more than maybe it seems like they've earned, wanting to be acknowledged for doing a certain amount of work even before any sort of meaningful outcome has been achieved. And then in more subtle ways, you can even trace back, indirectly things like, higher anxiety and depression, going into college when they're sort of most likely to be more on their own. or even online bullying. Actually, you can kind of, in many ways, you can trace this back to the indirect. Again, no one's intending to have these be the outcomes, but these are probably the indirect results, where when you only focus on the positive and when you only focus on exceptionalism, then you don't have a lot of development for people to feel comfortable or to have the skills to know how to deal with failure or suffering, or when they find themselves in a group where they're not exceptional. And like any stage in child development, when kids are not getting what they need from their caregivers, they improvise. And they just try to figure out how to do this stuff on their own. And because they are literally not mature or capable enough, right? I always say, like, if an adult is immature, that's a problem because they're an adult. If a kid is immature, it's because they're immature. So they're immature and they can't do it. Like, they literally can't, and yet they try. And so no matter what they're going to come up with, because it's outside the scope of what they're actually able to do on their own, it's going to be compromised. It's going to be unhealthy. It's going to be bad. And then the flip side of that is then we start accusing kids of what they come up with when they improvise. Oh, this kid's being manipulative. This kid is trying to push my buttons. This kid is yelling and screaming just to get my attention. Yes, because that's what they're improvising. Yes, they are being manipulated, and that is totally immature. But again, it's because they're immature. So all these kind of outcomes that we see from positive parenting also has to do with the underdevelopment of the sort of like intrinsic, internal sort of coping strategies, the autonomy, the competency, that they should be developing with sort of more like a social, emotionally supported style of parenting and learning.
Yeah. And I just want to make a clarification, because we have been talking about, quote, positive parenting, and positive parenting by Jane Nelson, actually does have the values that I think we would all share, of like still having limits and still, it's positive in its approach, but it's not like hands-off parenting, nor is it
overly behavioral.
Nor is it behavioral. So that as an approach, I don't want to get into like different specific people's teachings, but what we're talking when we're talking about the difficulties with working with kids and only saying positive things and not having limits and having those kids rely on praise is definitely problematic. So I just wanted to clarify that one little bit. Yeah. Okay, so we got what not to do kind of on both ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And now if we want to choose a parenting style that does bring out the best in kids and ultimately like what we're really wanting for our children, what does that look like? Maybe what is some of the research that points us into a particular direction?
So I think a couple of core ideas, I think, in terms of parenting styles that ultimately are going to lead to that sort of healthy adult maturity. One is that it needs to be a developmental perspective, which means that we have different parenting approaches at different stages of childhood. So, roughly we can say like the very early years, the super important aspects of parenting are built around attachment and relationships. Then after sort of maybe those early years, then we talk about social emotional kind of development and developing those kinds of skills where they grow a little bit more in their autonomy and their competency and in their relationships. Then adolescence is, again, very different, in terms of parenting roles. We go from gardeners, when they're children, tending to their different needs and different plants having different needs. And then parents to adolescents when their brain tells them, I need to get ready for my own adulthood. then we should stop being gardeners, and we need to be like consultants that they trust, that they find to be reliable sources of information and support. While at the same time, consultants need to understand that consultants don't run or own the company. So you kind of have to find this like balance, but it's a different role than, in terms of how we help and support and scaffold teenagers and adolescents. And then there's something that probably is more relevant today than it's ever historically been. And I don't know that we actually have the best answers so far, but then there is this new era of parent relationships with adult children where, that endpoint of like totally self-sufficient, I'm okay in the world, adulthood, 30, 40 years ago, like people at 25 at that point had their me identity as an adult well established. They had their we identity established too, because they were probably married, had kids, and were in the middle of their career track by 25. And if we're looking at like 2017, at 25, like there's very few people in sort of modern society who know exactly who they are, self-identity, and have established the importance of who they are to other people in shared life at 25. That's not happening either. So there's this kind of extra phase that I think we're still figuring out, which is what's a healthy dynamic between adult parents of adult children, and how we continue to support and scaffold them sort of post-adolescence as well. So that's one, a developmental approach, right? Which includes very specifically understanding that at different stages of life, our roles and our priorities should be different. And then I think the common track throughout that, which probably sounds very different than like a behaviorally focused perspective, is one that really thinks about supporting optimal growth and maturity. And so instead of, again, behavior is, a perspective that kind of really looks at the moment. And I think when you're looking at development and maturity, you are thinking about like this arch over life, over time, right? And so I think those are two primary perspective shifts. And then in the details, which we can talk about, a lot more social emotional learning and skill building than probably what most people sort of tend to emphasize when they think about parenting or education, but a lot more social emotional development.
So the thing that comes immediately to mind for me is, first of all, it's fascinating. There's like this other phase of,
extended adolescence.
Yeah.
The boomerang kid, or maybe they aren't a boomerang kid, but they still haven't discovered who they are.
And so that's one thing that I find fascinating. But the thing that occurred for me as you were describing this is, why now? I mean, why is it that all of a sudden we're looking at this as being a new way of looking at the parent life cycle? And why is it that this isn't something that we've looked at before? We talked a little bit about the history of behavioralism and where that came from, and behaviorism kind of has shifted parenting. But before that, what was this what was going on? Was there this developmental approach? And maybe I don't know if you're in a place to be able to discuss that, but that is something that I'm just kind of curious about. Is this something brand new that we're just like, hey, this sounds like a good idea, let's try this out? Or is this something that we're like, this is something that we used to do, we've forgotten about it, or we've fallen away from it, and we're trying to get back to that?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's, we haven't talked too much about the sort of the research and the brain science of it, but kind of talking about the arc of history with psychology, these days neuroscience is a lot more sort of cohesive with psychology. So I think psychology used to be thought of as a soft science, but because we actually have a lot more sort of data over the past few decades, and then you add this sort of neuroscience and neuroimaging component to it, it's all kind of converging. So psychology has become much more scientific. So unlike behaviorism, which was sort of like pseudoscientific in the sense that it was like, yes, accurate relative to animals, but it became pseudoscientific when they made the leap to say, and therefore humans, which the science was good. Scientists, on the other hand, are biased human beings. So what we know, though, is then you go back to the intuition of someone like Freud, way back, and some of those intuitions about like subconscious things that you don't remember in your childhood absolutely shape how you perceive the world, how you feel, how safe or dangerous the world is, how safe other people are, your expectations, that a lot of that is shaped by early life stuff. Turns out that these days we can like verify that through attachment psychology, through neuroimaging, through things like that say like, yeah, totally true.
Can you give us an example of that?
The neuroimaging, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that's a great thing.
That's the research around attachment or neuroimaging.
Because I do think that is one thing that has happened now. That's like, this points to, and this also gives validity to this style of parenting. So sorry if we took you off track there, but I think that's a great point.
Okay, so I think like two good sort of neuroscience kind of perspectives on this. Let's say to stitch together what we're talking about with behaviorism and how that affects like the limbic system and the reward circuits versus this other part of the brain that we're talking about, our prefrontal cortex. We do know that, yes, the prefrontal cortex developmentally is the part of the brain that when you look at mature human brains of adults, a lot of things like emotional regulation, abstract reason, complex problem solving, empathy, these types of like higher level human skills, those reside, in the prefrontal cortex. You also do comparative biology and you look at like world's smartest chimpanzee versus, average human brain. Where's the extra 20% real estate in the human brain? It's the prefrontal cortex, right? And then you also look at, let's say, okay, so when a infant is born, relative to what the adult mature brain looks like, what parts are underdeveloped? Again, prefrontal cortex, right? And as we see that part of the brain growing, we also see these properties emerging. And then neuroimaging looks backwards and can say like, oh, in the right medial prefrontal cortex, this circuit starts to initiate here. So this is kind of how like, modern sort of advances in functional imaging, then tied to neuroanatomy, tied to developmental psychology, and then we can all stitch it together and create a pretty cohesive narrative that ties, development into like one story. So we know things like, let's say, comparative development. Kids who experience trauma, let's say, compared to kids who, let's say, come from very warm sort of families where their attachment needs are met, you can observe differences in the level in which their prefrontal cortex is developing, for example. All right, so you can do a study like that. And so we know that kind of what I said earlier, that spending more time activating those more primitive parts of the brain at minimum costs you the development of the more sophisticated parts of the brain. And so we also then kind of look at, let's say, attachment psychology, which is the construct of kind of saying, what does a kid need, in those early years of life? And we can formulate those ideas into a mnemonic, the 4 S's. If kids come out of their childhood feeling safe and secure and seen and soothed, then essentially their attachment needs are met. And then they are sort of like optimally geared towards social, emotional, and prefrontal cortex development. And kids who have insecure attachments, they continue to have sort of like a more irregular sort of pattern of development where, sometimes their limbic system still calls the shots, their fear-based parts of their brain still calls the shots. So we can see that, in terms of how development and our understanding of how the brain works and grows is connected to, like, let's say, early life experience. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the most fascinating things that you've talked about is the differences between the kids that have had different experiences and how it affects their brains. So yeah, I find that really interesting.
I feel like we could continue to talk. It's always fascinating to talk to you. Every time we sit down, we have these great conversations, and we end up hitting topics that I think are fascinating to us and fascinating to the people that come to these conferences. And you put it together in a way that is easy to understand, and I think really gives a strong argument of why we want intrinsic motivation and compassionate parenting for as parents and adults in kids' lives, and why,
and a compassionate approach to education, and why we want to emphasize social emotional learning.
Yeah. So anyhow, I appreciate all that you put into this, and the way that you're able to take all this information and put it together in a way that a simple human like me can understand, because I know I can't understand.
Our prefrontal cortex.
Mine's still developing. But as we're wrapping up here, Joy, is there anything that you wanted to say here at the end, or any final ask that you would like to make for folks, or anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to make sure to go over?
I think we definitely talked broadly about a lot of maybe ideas, and we didn't get into specifics, at least not too much in terms of strategies. But I do think that my day job is actually that I'm a therapist. I'm a psychiatrist, but I predominantly have a therapy practice. And therapists are in the business of helping people to really change, right? And grow. And I find, and I think this is generally true for most people, that if you can start with a good insight, right? If you can start with a good insight that says, oh my gosh, I never realized that before, but now that I'm thinking about it, that is so much more true, and that resonates with me so much more. And when I think about my life, all the evidence is more supportive of this aha moment that I just had. And I think oftentimes, if that insight also makes sense of why things previously, when you had a different perspective, was not really working either, then I think those are the great insights. And usually that's the beginning, where that insight then turns into some sort of meaningful intention, where the person says, now that I know this, I got to do things differently. And usually if that insight and that intention is big enough, then it actually leads people to actually doing something differently. And so, oftentimes when I'm talking and it's a conversation, I know it sometimes feels like it's lacking in terms of details, but what I'm really hoping, and the intention actually is in these sort of conversations, is to help people to make sense of, why a more sort of social, emotional, intrinsic process of parenting education is more accurate and helpful and truthful. And in talking about it this way, especially some of the time we spent talking about why behaviorism doesn't work, and how that also links to the hindrance that behaviorism is relative to this path that we want, it also makes sense as to why we want to get away from, maybe something that's much more familiar and integrated into the way that we've been doing things for a long time. So I do hope that, if I can sort of reframe that this in many ways was hopefully the best use of our time, is to try to maybe do a perspective or a lens shift in a believable way to kind of change the perspective and motivate people to kind of reassess and look elsewhere, in terms of approaches, which I'm sure, all the other speakers at this conference will also support that perspective. And I think that that's part of this too, which is, you have this whole conference where there are experts, and there are plenty of people who have been doing education and parenting in this sort of like social, emotional, intrinsically motivated fashion. And there is a lot of, there's other people out there that do have the specifics. So, to kind of collaborate with what we talked about here with some of that, I think does sort of paint a whole picture. So.
Well said. I like that a lot. Is there a way, or what is the best way for people to connect with you online?
So I have a blog. My blog is mentalhealthinessblog.com. And I've written different articles there, some from my main background about mental health, but a lot of it is about some of what we've talked about, the value of emotions, both positive and negative, why as human beings, our beliefs are more important than our behavior, the role of empathy in everything that we do, how relationships are really the foundation of well-being. So even if we didn't cover all those topics here, I've talked about and written about some of those a little bit more extensively on my blog. So I think there's a lot of good reading there as well, if people want to kind of round out some of these experiences, or maybe just touched upon things that maybe there's a little bit more to read and learn about on my blog.
Fantastic. We'll include the links.
Mentalhealthinessblog.com. Yeah.
We'll include the links to that in the show notes, and there is a wealth of information there, and you do have, you go really deep, and yet it's easy to understand. So I've always appreciated that in our conversations with you. Thanks again.
And if people want to do a workshop with you in person, you do workshops in Southern California?
I do, yeah. So my practice is in Southern California, and I've been doing different talks in different places. So if there's information about stuff that I'm doing or I'm about to do, either online or in person, should be able to find that on my blog as well as I update those things.
Perfect. And I can vouch for those meetings with you. Those presentations you give are always entertaining. And not only are you a master of slides, but you are a master of speaking. And it's just so enjoyable to have those workshops with you. So thank you again. It's, as always, enjoyable talking with you and so insightful. And we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us here at the conference. We'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, always enjoy these as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.